Hello friends, welcome back once again to another new video on MapStruct. So in my last video, I have covered how to map enum values in MapStruct. In this video, we will learn some basic things we can use during mapping using MapStruct. Okay, so let's get started guys. So let me go to my workspace. So this is the project I am using to demonstrate the examples on MapStruct. Let me open the bins which I am gonna use for today's video. Let me open this one, customer entity class and customer DTO class. So these two bins I'll use for mapping. Okay, so see, in customer entity class we have the field like ID, name, country, registration date and type. Similarly, in customer DTO I have the field like customer ID corresponding to ID, customer name corresponding to name, country name and registration date. Okay, so to map between the customer to customer DTO and customer DTO to customer, I have also created one mapper, that is customer mapper. Let me open the mapper package, and here we have the customer mapper. Understood? So inside customer mapper, I have already added the source to target mapping. Here you can see two method is there, two entity which converts customer DTO to customer, and two DTO is there which converts customer to customer DTO. So here in case of two entity, customer DTO is our source. Okay, so in customer DTO we have the customer ID, but in target we have ID. That means in entity class customer we have ID. Similarly, in customer DTO we have customer name as field, but in customer we have only name as field name. Okay, and here country name is there, but here only country is there, and registration date is same for both the cases. But I have added this, so you know, if the source and target field name is same, we don't need this mapping annotation. But I have added this because I want to add a date format for this field, which is nothing but in the format ddmmyy. Okay, so that is the mapping stuffs. So first thing we'll learn how we can ignore a specific fields using mapping. Let's take this example. This one, customer ID and ID. Okay, so I don't want to map customer ID to this ID. That means whatever value coming in this customer DTO, I don't want to map it to ID of this customer field, because I have already added the generator here to auto generated this ID for customer. Okay, so even if I will provide customer ID in this customer DTO, that will not map to the ID of customer entity class. Okay, so how we can ignore this mapping then? Here if you see, I have added source is customer ID and target is ID. So that means I have added the mapping for this ID field, customer ID field, but I don't want to map this one. So how I can ignore this thing? So I can simply add here ignore property. Okay, there is a property called ignore. So I can add ignore is equal to true. So what happens? Even if you provided a ID in customer DTO, that will not map to the ID of customer entity because we ignored this field. Okay, if we will not map this field, that will throw a warning like this ID property is not mapped. But if you don't want to map these fields, then you can exclude these fields during mapping. So how we can exclude this field during mapping? By using this ignore property. Okay, so that's how you can ignore a field using MapStruct. Understood? So now we'll see another scenario, that is inverse mapping. So what is that inverse mapping? Inverse mapping is nothing but if we have the bidirectional mapping like entity to DTO and DTO to entity. Here we are converting customer DTO to customer and customer entity to customer DTO. So our mapping is bidirectional here, and the mapping definition for the forward method and the reverse method is same. Then we can simply inverse the configuration by using an annotation. Okay, so what does that mean actually? See here. While we are converting customer DTO to customer, we are doing source to target mapping like customer ID to ID, customer name to name, country name to country, registration date to registration date, or whatever any other field is there. will add accordingly. And similarly, when we are converting customer to customer DTO, in this case also we are just swapping the source and target. We are just swapping the source or target means here in this case our source is customer and target is customer DTO. So we are just swapping the field. Here source is ID, target is customer ID. So here source is name, target is customer name. Source is country, target is country name. So this is nothing but the inverse of this mapping, isn't it? So here our source is customer ID, target is ID. So in this case, here source is ID and target is customer ID. So in this case, source is customer name, target is name. And here source is name and target is customer name, and so on and so forth. So this mapping is nothing but the exact inverse of this mapping, isn't it? So instead of using all those things, can I just simply replace this with one annotation? Yes, I can do this. I can just comment it out. Let me comment it out, the whole things. So this is a TDX task, right? So our mapping definition is same for both the method. When we are converting customer DTO to customer or customer to customer DTO, our mapping definition is same. So why we should map it again, the same things? So we can simply replace it by using @inherit inverse configuration. So that will do the exact same thing. Understood? So if I go to the implementation class, then you can check how it looks like actually. So let me go to the target, generate resources, annotation, then customer mapper IMPL. So see here. So for customer DTO to customer, this is the thing. We have set the name, country, registration date. Okay. Customer ID is not set. Why? Because in our mapper we ignored this field, customer ID. Okay, that's why here customer ID is not set. Understood? And when we are converting to DTO also, here customer name is set, country name is set, and registration date is set. So that is exact the inverse of this one, two entity. Two DTO method is the inverse of two entity. So we can use @inherit inverse configuration for the mapping. Understood? So this is the another scenario. How we can do the inverse mapping using MapStruct. Okay. So let me give you another scenario. So see here in customer we have a type field is there. Okay. But in customer DTO I don't have any type field. Okay. So that means while saving the data to database, this customer entity, I want to save one field like type, which is a constant. When I will save a new record, that type will save as new. That means it is a new customer. So this is a constant, right? So I don't want to put it in the customer DTO. So I can declare a constant for it. Okay. So here I can add the mapping like this. Just mark here @mapping. So directly I can add the target over here. Okay, because here source is not present. In customer DTO type is not present. So I can directly add target over here. Target is what? Target is type, and this type must be mapped to what? I can declare a constant over here. I can declare a constant, let's say that is new. So whenever I save a new customer, so this type field must be inserted as new in my database. Understood? This type will not be varied. Okay, so this is a constant. So I can simply define a constant in my mapping. So this is nothing but new. Okay. So here our source property is not defined. So we can directly define a constant and map to the target type. So this is how we can define a constant for our mapping. Okay. So if I go to my implementation, you can check now customer.setType is new is set here. Okay. There is no source is there. Directly the type is set to new. So similarly, you can use a default value as well for your mapping. Default value means suppose you have a source, like let's say this country. Okay, let's take an example of this country. So you have the source like country name and target is country. Let's say in your DTO you have not passed this country name, but you want to add a default value for this. So let's say I can add a default value like this. You can add like this: default value is equal to, let's say, India. Okay, so if I will not pass any value in my customer DTO, automatically the target is set to what? This default value India. If the value comes in this customer DTO, then it will set that value to my target country. But if no value will be there, then the default value will be set to this target country. So that is nothing but India. So this is the default value. So what is the default value then? If a source property is null, then we can set that corresponding target value to a default value. So if I go to my implementation class, then you can see here customer DTO.get country name not equal to null. That means if in customer DTO country name is present, then this country name will set to customer. Yes, this default value which is India will be set to the country. Okay, so that's how you can use the default value. Understood? So we know how we can define a constant. So constant value will always be used regardless of source value. Okay, here inside customer DTO the source is not present, that type is not present, but in the target we can set a constant value as new. But for the default value, if the source is present, then that will set to the target, but if the source is not present, then default value is set to the target. Okay, this is the default value. Okay, so now we learn another thing, that is default expression. We can use the default expression for our mapping also. So MapStruct also supports default expression, which is a combination of default values and expression. So we can use it when the source attribute is null. So when the source attribute is null, we can use default expression like default value. When the source attribute is null, we can use this default value. Similarly, we can use the default expression also when the source attribute is null. So let's take example of this registration date here. Okay, so for this registration date, we have used the source and target mapping, and the date format we have provided. So let's say in DTO, in customer DTO, our registration date is not present. So we can use the default expression to map it to our target. Okay, so how we can use the default expression? So we can simply do like this: default expression is equal to, we can use, just check here, we can use Java, then our expression is like this: local date dot now. Sorry, J is small here. Okay, so what does that mean? So if the registration date is not present in our source, that is inside customer DTO, then we can use this default expression. So default expression is the combination of default values and expression. Okay, so default value is what? Default value is local date dot now. If the date is not present, then it will take the local date dot now value. We need to import this class in our mapper. Okay, so here I can import this like imports is equal to local date dot what class. Okay, we can import this local date class to use it inside our mapping. Understood? So now let's check how our implementation class looks like. So see here for the registration date. So if the registration date come, that means if the registration date is not equal to null, then it will set registration date is equal to local date dot parse. It will take the registration date and parse it to this format DDMM as we have provided the format. Okay, else it will set local date dot now. Understood? Because we have provided the default expression. Okay, so default expression is clear. If the source value is null, then we can use default expression to map our target value. Understood? So this is how we can use default expression, constant, default values and how we can ignore a particular fields. If you don't want to map the field, you can use the ignore. Okay, and if our mapping is bidirectional and if the mapping definition for both the methods is same, then we can use this @inherit inverse configuration. Okay, so let me quickly run this application to check whether our mapping is working or not. Okay, so my application started. To test this mapping also I have created one controller, customer controller. Here I have two endpoints is there, /customer to save the customer and customer/id to get customer by id. So let me go to my browser and hit localhost swaggerui.html to check those endpoints. Okay, so this is my customer controller. Let me save some data quickly. So country name. Okay, so let me remove this country name to see whether our default value is coming or not. And customer ID. Okay, let me provide customer ID here 100. We'll check this customer ID 100 is saved to our database or not. Okay, customer name, let me provide like Flipkart. Okay, registration date. I don't want to pass the registration date because I want to check with the default expression. So let me hit execute. Sorry, one comma is there. See here, ID 83, name Flipkart, default value is coming, country India. Okay, because we have provided the default value. If no country name is present over there, then this default value will be set to our target. Okay, then registration date, see, registration date, today's date is coming. As we have not provided here registration date, that will automatically pick up the default expression value, which is local date.now, that means today's date. And type is new, automatically this constant will be map. As we have provided type as new. We have defined a constant, right? We have defined a constant here. Type is new. So that is automatically map to type. Okay, clear? Yeah, one more thing I would like to say here. See here, we have provided the customer ID as 100, but here it's coming 83 because we have ignored this field for mapping. We have ignored this customer ID field for mapping. Ignore is equal to true. So whatever value will provide in the customer detail, it will not map to this ID. This ID will be automatically generated. Okay. So these things, and let me hit get endpoint now. Okay, so here customer name is coming, country name is coming, registration date is coming. So here customer ID is coming also null. Why? Because here we have provided ignore true. Okay, and here we have used @inherit inverse configuration. So this is the only the inverse of this method. Okay, so if you want customer ID in customer DTO, then you can use it manually like this. You can add the mapping like this. Now in my customer DTO, the customer ID will come because we have added it manually. So let me hit the get endpoint again to check. So see, customer ID is now coming. Understood? So we see some basic things we usually do during mapping, like how we can ignore some specific fields during mapping, how we can use default value and constant value, also default expression we have seen, and also how we can inverse our mapping by using @inherit inverse configuration. So we have seen all those things in this video. So with this I have covered the most commonly used MapStruct mapping, starting from basic mappings to custom mapping, mapping child entities, mapping multiple sources. Also we looked into different options provided by MapStruct like mapping different data types, enum mapping, and how to use default expression and constant during mapping. Okay, so there are also other scenarios during source to target mapping in which we can use MapStruct to make our life easy during mapping, but it's not possible to cover all those things in one go. So I'll suggest please go through all the videos in this playlist, and if you have encountered any difficulties or if you have any queries regarding MapStruct or you want to know other mapping scenario while mapping source to target, please let me know in the comment box so that I'll try to resolve your queries. I'll share the GitHub link of this entire project in the description box so that you can download and test by yourself. So that's it for today's video, guys. In my next video, I'll come up with another new topic. Till then, keep watching. Thank you.